How about the trivia quiz? I'll go over the answers. If you've got one of these answers and want to show off, feel free to speak up. First of all, what did Susan B. Anthony have to do with D-Day?
Can you give us a clue?
Well, she wasn't there. All right, but there was a ship named Susan B. Anthony, which was actually, I think Roosevelt said, okay, now you belong to the Army. But anyway, it was formerly a ship that would take loads of goods around the world, and they decided they could put men on it to take them to Africa first, and then they used it in the D-Day invasion. But there was a problem. Out of the 700 ships going in on Normandy beaches, this is the first one that sunk. It had 2 explosions. They're not sure. Probably one was a mine underwater, even though they had completely cleansed the beach of mines, they said. But it probably was a mine underwater. But there's a good ending to the story, even though it still sits 50 feet under the water. No one had told him to do this, but one of the guys said, hey, we're so close to that next boat, why don't we just throw our cargo net over? And they did, and every single guy got across there. At least he survived that part of it, but it was still a dangerous mission. All right, number 2. Who's the only person, not a World War II veteran, buried at the Saint-Laurent Cemetery in Normandy? Quentin Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's youngest son, who flew in World War I. He actually was kind of a risky kind of guy, probably trying to live up to his dad's reputation. But Quentin was shot down over Cramery, France, which doesn't mean anything to me, but it's somewhere in France, in World War I, in a dogfight with some of the first German flyers. He at the time was engaged to a girl named Flora Whitney, part of the Vanderbilt Whitney family. And over the objection of her family, who thought the Roosevelts weren't quite enough for her. Okay, he's buried at Normandy because when his oldest brother, Teddy Jr., went in Normandy, he was then a general, because he had served in World War I, re-upped, went back in, and Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Had a heart attack and died, and was given the Congressional Medal of Honor for his work at Normandy, and he was buried in that cemetery, and the people of France thought it would be appropriate that the guy who was a hero for them would be moved over there. So Quentin is the only one. He's buried right next to his brother. In fact, very close to where the Nyland brothers from Buffalo, one of which was the object of Private Ryan, the movie Private Ryan. That really is about the Nyland family from Buffalo. Okay. What 2 Baseball Hall of Famers took part in D-Day? Well, he was in the war, and he was a fighter pilot, but not him. Warren Spahn and Yogi Berra. Okay, so quite a battery. The person who got the medals equal to that of Audie Murphy was another guy from Buffalo. His name is Matt Urban. Had just as many medals as Audie Murphy, but not all the fame. The town that they served meals every day to servicemen going across on the trains. Anyone know that one? North Platte, Nebraska. And all of it was volunteer, and they did it for every day of the war. Okay, now it's pretty well deserted now because they pulled the railroad tracks up. The railroad doesn't go through there anymore. Bedford, Virginia, and Holly, New York. Well, Bedford, Virginia, obviously the Bedford Boys, they lost the most boys of one town in World War II. Holly lost 11 guys in Vietnam, the most of any individual town. Which, if you obviously you know the size of Holly, that's an awful large number. Henry Ford. Well, Henry Ford had factories. And Henry Ford, well, actually in the 30s, he got a good deal on rubber working with Germany. And Hitler in 1933 said he's the Henry Ford is the man I most admire. And Henry Ford's factory in Cologne produced tanks for the Nazis, and his factories here produce vehicles for us. Sort of working both sides of the fence. Okay. The 5th floor of the Ottawa Hospital was extraterritorial because Princess Julianna came from the Netherlands and had baby Margarite there. And they had to make it Dutch territory so she could eventually be in line for the throne. Otherwise, she wouldn't have been officially okay to be the queen. But she never was a queen anyway. They went past her. East Rochester Piano Works, they did the boxes, oh, you know what I did? Uh-oh, I'm going to catch up here. There's Susan B. Anthony. I forgot I had this little gadget. There's a Susan B. Anthony. Okay. There's Quentin Roosevelt. I've got to coordinate my presentation here. Okay. There's Yogi and Warren. Okay. There's Matt Urban from the 10th Ward in Buffalo, if any of you are from Buffalo. North Platte, Nebraska. Now, the one thing about North Platte is they gave them all popcorn balls at the end they could take with them. And the guys at someplace on the way over, they would eat a popcorn ball, and all of a sudden they'd receive the address for a girl they could write back and forth to at home. They could have a pen pal. These are the Bedford Boys, and they lost over 30 of them on one day going into Normandy. Henry Ford and Princess Julianna and Margarite. East Rochester Piano Works manufactured this part of the glider, the cabin of that glider, the Waco glider, which was the one the Americans used. The Horsa was the one that the British used to go in the night before, parachute to land, and the British used it to destroy the bridge at Osterham, which was the longest day. You saw the guy going to blow up the bridge. There are 24 American cemeteries overseas. And there's a fellow who recently wrote a book. He was writing a book about Walter Cronkite and some other World War II reporters. And his name is Timothy Gay. And in July of 2011, he went over to Colleville-sur-Mer Cemetery in Normandy. And he was trying to locate a friend named John Murphy. Well, actually wasn't a friend of his. He was a brother-in-law of a famous writer, correspondent at the time named Hal Doyle. But he was from Timothy Gay's hometown. So they went to the man who's in charge of the cemetery, and all those cemeteries are American property given to us for our men to be buried there and women to be buried there. And he said, I want to look up a man named John Doyle. He said, well, I'll look and see where it is, because he's got a big book, you know, and there are thousands of people buried there. And he found 2 John Doyles, but neither one was the one he was looking for, because his remains had been repatriated to the States. A lot of families after the war decided they wanted to bring them their boy home. But he did find out that there are 2 other John Murphys there. And he found out that there were 27 World War II John Murphys buried in foreign cemeteries. Now, I mention that, and I think the importance is that we don't understand how enormous this effort was. If you have 27 guys named John Murphy who were killed and didn't make it home, I know one John Murphy, okay, and to me it was profound. 418,000 Americans died in World War II. Now, Russia lost millions and Germany lost millions, but 418,000 Americans. All right, I want to tell you a few stories about these people that I think are important, but you might not have ever heard of them. First, we have Elgin Staples. Elgin Staples is actually Elgin Staples and his mother, Berra. And Elgin Staples served on USS Astoria in the Savo Islands in the Pacific. And he went out, he was a very young guy, he was like 17, and the guys on the crew used to tease him all the time because he always had this life belt with him, okay? He always knew where it was, and he was quick to grab it. He was on duty up on deck one night, and he came off of duty at midnight, went downstairs in his bunk, and all of a sudden they he hears an explosion, and they were hit by a torpedo. So he went to his station and put on his life belt. As he's running up, he no sooner gets to the top of the deck and they get hit again, he gets thrown into the water. And he spent over 3 hours in the water, and fortunately for him, a destroyer came along, picked him up, and took him back. The Astoria had not sunk. It was a little tipsy, but it hadn't sunk. Put him back on there. About 3 hours later, they get hit again. He gets dumped into the drink for the second time. This time he spent over 5 hours in the water, got picked up by another destroyer. They took him to an island called Noumes, I think, Noumes. And because his ship has been sunk, and I don't know the policy at that time, but they sent him home on leave. So he goes home on leave back to Akron, Ohio, and he wanted to show his mom this life belt that had saved his life, especially since it was made at the Goodyear factory in Akron. So he goes back and he's showing his mom, and she said, well, let me see that. Because he didn't know his mother, Berra, had taken a job at the Goodyear factory as an inspector, and she's the one, she looked at it, that was her number. She had inspected that life belt. And he, for the rest of his life, he told a story about how she saved his life from thousands of miles away twice in one day. Okay, this is radio man Roy Maletta. And Roy had lost, he was on the USS Tang. Now, I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to go to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, but if you haven't, it's a wonderful visit. And I was just down there 2 weeks ago for my second trip down there. And they've built the USS Tang inside of the museum. And you get on board and you relive the day that the USS Tang actually was sunk. It went out and it torpedoed some Japanese vessels, and then it got sunk. Well, Roy, a couple weeks before that, had been working on the Tang. He went between one area and another, and his hand got caught in the door, and he had the end of his thumb taken off. Okay. The USS Tang gets sunk. They sent the Western Union home to his parents, were sorry to inform. But then a couple days later, they get a letter from Roy saying, I'm stationed at so-and-so. And they found out that the War Department didn't know that he'd been put on shore duty just before the Tang was sunk. Okay, and this is the Tang itself, apparently visiting New York. Okay, some people are lucky to survive and feel lucky to survive. This is Charlie Scheffel, and Charlie was a graduate of Oklahoma A&M University. He was a great basketball player, played for Tex Winter, made it to the NIT championship game, and he also played baseball there. And he told, when I contacted him, I saw him on TV one day in one of these HBO specials, and so I looked it up and I called him, and I said, thanks for your service. And that's how I got most of these stories, is that thanking people for their service. And he said, I went to Rochester once. He said, it was a great softball pitcher there. I said, you mean Shifty Gears? And he was surprised I knew who he was talking. And then he surprised me. He said, you know, the Softball Hall of Fame is in Oklahoma City. You know whose statue's out in front of it? Shifty Gears. So, but he was in, when he finished college, he had been a ROTC guy, and he was sent directly over to the war effort, only they sent him to Africa to work with the Brits. And it was kind of confusing for him because he didn't know exactly which army he was in. And, you know, and then there came a day that he had his outfit out, and they were doing battle with some of Rommel's guys, and they're getting really beaten badly. And he calls in for support, and they send him some air support, and all of a sudden the air support took off. He said, wait, I need air support. So in come the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen. It was their first time flying as a unit, and they saved his bacon that day. Well, 50 years later, he's back in Oklahoma. He was a successful insurance agent, and he heard that the Orange Bowl was going to have General Benjamin Davis there as the honored person to oversee the parade. And Benjamin Davis, he knew, flew that day to save his bacon. So he and his wife went down to Miami, and they went out really early to the review stand, and they looked up and waved to him, and he hollered up to Davis something relating to the place he was and thanked him. Davis came down and they got to meet. Well, the other part of the story with Charlie Scheffel is something else that happened 50 years apart. After he finished in Africa, he was sent up into Europe, and he went across and was near Aachen, just entering Germany with his outfit, and they got themselves in a tough spot, and there was an explosion, and it killed his radio man, and it injured him. And he was sent to England to recover. So he went to England for months, I don't know how many months, 3 or 4 months, to do his full recovery because he had some significant injuries. And he was right near the end of his recovery. He was out for a walk on orders by the doctor to do a certain amount of walking to get his leg back in shape. And he saw this man walking down towards him, and he looked familiar. And he looked at him, and he walked by, and the guy, he said hello to the guy, and the guy just kind of grunted at him. Then he walked past. When he got 10 feet past him or so, the guy turned and said, "Hey, are you a Yank?" And he turned and he said, "Well, yeah." And he went up to him, and the guy said, "I've got a question for you. Are you afraid of dying?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I was only married for a week before I left. I've been away from home for a year and a half. I really want to get back home. Yes, I am afraid of dying." And they talked a little bit more, and they separated. Well, then after he separated, he realized who this guy was. It was George Bernard Shaw. So again, 50 years later, his daughter, who lives in Texas, invites him to come down to see a George Bernard Shaw play called The Chocolate Soldier. Okay? In the middle of the second act, Charlie almost fell off his seat because this is The Chocolate Soldier is about a Swiss mercenary who's being separated from his fiancée to go to war. And she asked him, "Are you afraid to die?" And what happened was, Shaw, who wrote that play in the 1890s, asked Charlie the question in 1944, and Charlie realized why he asked the question in 1994, because he wanted to see what the reaction. And Charlie said, and the soldier reacted the same way I did. So he was checking what he'd written. It's interesting how accidental meetings can have a lifetime impact. Near us on Henderson, up until recently, there was a man named Don Snyder. And he grew up in Rochester. And one day on his way to school or wherever, he saw a couple of his buddies picking on this guy named Eddie Crone. Now, he wasn't no friend of Eddie Crone's, but he thought it was really, he wanted to stop this bullying. So he went over and said to his buddies, "Knock it off, quit bothering this guy." Well, then Eddie wanted to be his good buddy. And he really didn't want to be Eddie's good buddy, so they never struck up a real friendship. A few years later, they both end up at Hobart College. And they're in separate fraternities, but they recognize each other, and they talk, and they had some conversation. Next year, the war starts, and they both join the military. Don went through 5 major battles, including the Battle of the Bulge. Eddie Crone was taken prisoner in the Battle of the Bulge. Okay? And he was taken prisoner, and he was held in Dresden. And Eddie Crone is actually the Billy Pilgrim that Kurt Vonnegut wrote about in Slaughterhouse-Five. And Don said, if I knew he was there, I was within 20 miles of that, I'd have saved his bacon again. Vonnegut came to Rochester almost 20 years ago and snuck into Mount Hope Cemetery because he wanted to say goodbye to Eddie Crone, who had passed away since. But he was a subject of Slaughterhouse-Five. Now, some people get a chance to revisit the past. This is Harry Ettlinger. And Harry Ettlinger grew up in a very small city in Germany near Baden-Baden called Karlsruhe. And he was the last Jewish boy to have his bar mitzvah at that temple before the Nazis burned it. And his family was on the last boat to leave. And they went to Brooklyn. And he grew up in Brooklyn, or went to high school in Brooklyn, and near the end of the war, he decided he would join the military. And he went through all the training to be an infantryman, and he's on the big trucks full of guys, ready to be sent to the Battle of the Bulge as reinforcement. And a guy comes by and calls him and 4 of the guys off of the rigs, because Harry was fluent in German because he'd grown up in Germany, and the monuments men who were to save of the works of art that had been stolen The monuments men were being formed, and they needed someone who could be an interpreter, who could talk to the people in German to find out where Hitler's guys had hidden these works of art. And so Harry worked with the monuments men, and that picture on the right is from Altasee, and that's in the Austrian mountains. And I went in there 2 summers ago to take a look, and it's set up just like that. And they hid lots of works of art there, as well as many other places. Well, Harry had some time off in late 1945. They continued to work after the war. He had some time off, and he and his driver named Ike, who was a survivor of a concentration camp, drove back to Karlsruhe, where his opa, his grandpa, Oppenheimer, had hidden some etchings in the wall of a factory. And he went back and got them out, and he was able to bring them home to his grandpa. And if you look on the right, you'll see the etching, one of the etchings that he brought home to his grandpa from the factory in Germany. He still lives in New Jersey, and that's on his apartment wall. Now, rescuing the art and the work with the monuments men wasn't just restricted to Americans. They had to have the help of some other people. This is Rose Valland, and she was a curator at Jeu de Paume in Paris. And when Göring came in to help steal the art to take it to what Hitler wanted to be his art fest in Austria, in his mother's hometown, Göring, who particularly liked Vermeers, had this lady who was a curator. She had to write down each of the things they were stealing. And so not only did she write those records down, but every evening she would go home and she had a book that she wrote each one down and where it was being sent. Now, if they'd have caught her with this book, she was done. Okay? In fact, she would have been done, except they needed her help. And she didn't know what time they would do her in, but she was keeping these records. When the Americans monuments men came in to recover these works of art, she was very helpful, but only after she found out she could trust them, because she didn't know if they were just going to take all this stuff to America. And she wanted it to return to the people who owned it and to the places in France where it belonged. Now, there she is at the Jeu de Paume, and there is also a picture of her getting the award of the Croix de Guerre from the French government, their highest award. Another French lady who worked in resistance worked as a leader of some of the people who were blowing things up and destroying Nazi equipment and that sort of thing. Her group was called the Alliance, and her name was Marie Madeleine Fourcade. She was called the Hedgehog Fourcade. And among other things, she was responsible for reporting intelligence to the British. So she would get on her communications and send information out. She got caught sending coded messages to England. And she escaped from her cell by taking all of her clothes off, holding them in her teeth, and squeezing between the bars and getting out. Now, some other people have encounters with important people. This is when I went on honor flight with my friend John, and some other guy walked up. Okay. That was part of our greeting at the World War II Memorial. And John, who I thought might be here today, wasn't able to make it, he gave me this other story. And it's about a guy named Al Petrillo. And some of you might know him. I did not know him, even though I had some common interest. He was into antique cars and things like that. He had a shop down in Charlotte. But while he was in the service, he started out on the USS Enterprise. And they happened to be on maneuvers the day of Pearl Harbor. And they came back in and pulled a lot of people out of the drink, saved a lot of lives that way. A couple years later, they got hit by two 1,500-pound bombs and disabled. And he got transferred to the Missouri, BB-63. And so he's the only guy I know who was at the very start of World War II, and he saw the peace treaty signed in September 1945 on the Missouri. And he's a Rochester person. Second part of the story is, in the 80s, he was in ill health. And John went to visit him in a hospital. And he said to John, you know, these people, they don't know what we did for them. They don't really know what we did. And John said, oh, that's a lot of baloney. And just then a young nurse came in and he said to the young nurse, hey, do you know what the USS Enterprise was? And she thinks, she said, yeah, Star Wars. He says, see, John? Okay, in April 1942, the Enterprise provided cover for Doolittle's raiders. They're B-25 Mitchells that were built especially to take some bombs over to Japan to show them that they could be hit, because they had told their people they wouldn't be touched. And in reality, they probably couldn't have been touched unless they built a special airplane. They took all the equipment off and just enough bombs to make some sort of dent to show them they could get it done. I was able to meet 4 of the 5 surviving Doolittle raiders a couple of years ago, and one of them is a guy named David Thatcher who lives near Missoula, Montana. And he was on plane number 7. And David Thatcher was a subject of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. He saved all of the guys on his plane were injured in some way when they landed in the water. All right, and he saved them and pulled them in and was able to help them escape to get to help by the Chinese. After they flew across over Japan, dropped the bombs, they went to China, and the Chinese hid them and got most of them out. There were 80 original ones. There are now 4 surviving now. And they had an agreement that that Doolittle bought this expensive alcohol. I don't know what it was, and they had 80 goblets made. And they used to meet every year, and they'd get together and try to get. They would, if a guy had passed away, they'd turn the goblet over. And then they said the agreement was, and when it got down to the last 2, they would share that bottle. Well, the 4 remaining one realized that's very unrealistic now to think they would ever drink that bottle. So they had their last meeting in Florida this past spring. But Thatcher's one of them, and Thatcher, there's what he looked like in 2012. He's alive and well. Well, this is Mats Tonelli. I jumped ahead a little bit here. This is Mats Tonelli. You might remember, and maybe not, he was a big football hero at Notre Dame in the 30s. And then when the war started, he went into the military. He was captured in Japan, and he spent 3.5 years as a POW. He survived the Bataan Death March. In the middle of the Bataan Death March, one of the men came by, one of the regular soldiers came by, and they saw that he had his Notre Dame ring on. And they said, give me that ring. And he said, no way. And the guy next to him said, give it to him. They'll kill you. I'm not going to do it. And finally he said, you got to give it to him. So he gave him the ring. And about 15 minutes later, the commandant of that prison came back to him and gave him back the ring. And he said, what's this? He said, well, I was there. I was a student at USC, and I saw you make that 77-yard touchdown run against us, and I know how much this means to you. And so he survived the Bataan Death March, and there he is with that ring on his hand. Okay. Now, the next story is a little closer to home. On Veterans Day, you know, there are a lot of places that you can get a free meal. And I went to Applebee's to get a free meal, and I was alone. And the lady said, well, you know, you're going to have to wait a little bit. I said, well, isn't there someone who's alone? She said, yeah, okay. So she sat me down next to the fellow named Frank Satta. Now, Frank Satta was from Webster, and he was in the Marines. And he landed on Saipan. And while he's on Saipan, he's been told to, or he sees down the beach, and they're under fire. He sees down the beach, there's a corpsman. He's calling him, come out here and help. So he gets down there and he said, you take over here. I got to go help the injured. And a lady was having a baby. And so Frank had to deliver a baby. And he said, but I have to tell you, I'm really proud I didn't kill anybody in World War II, but I brought one into the world. So then he goes later on he gets sent into occupied Japan, so he thinks it'd be really cool. He takes an old coffee can and scoops up some dirt from where the bomb had dropped. He's going to bring this home. And on the train home, he lost it. He said it was the luckiest thing I ever lost in my life. All right, sometimes, Frank was an example of someone helping out a child they didn't know, but that's really the custom for our GIs. Wherever they were, they took care of the kids. And even kids that belong to guys and people on the other side. GIs always have room for kids. And other people helped out the children too. Here's a lady, Irena Sendler. And Irena was the daughter of a doctor who lost his life to typhus when he helped out Jewish children who wouldn't be treated during World War I. And Irena was a worker in Zagota resistance, and she snuck out 2,500 Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto. All right. And so she saved 2,500. She also kept a record of their names and what their parents' names were, in case they were too small, would forget, and buried those names so they could be dug up later. Unfortunately, not many people survived to be reunited, but she kept this record, and you'll see there's what she was, what she looked when she was in the war, and in 2008 or 2005, that's what Irena looked like. This is Mo Berg, a lousy catcher but a great spy. When the Yankees, when the American League sent over an all-star team, Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth in 1934 to Japan, they picked a catcher who hit .234. And everyone's saying, why are you sending this guy? Well, he dressed up in a kimono and took a movie camera and went as a woman to visit the daughter of a State Department official who was in the hospital, took off the kimono, snuck up on top of the roof, and took movies of their installations, their harbor, and the whole thing, which Doolittle used in his raid 8 years later. He was, a peacetime spy for us. So, lousy catcher, but a good spy. Okay, ball turret, Sergeant Alan McGee. Alan McGee was only 5'7". That made him very able to fit in that little space down there. And he was a ball turret man on a B-17. And his B-17 was called Snap, Crackle, and Pop. And they were coming back from a bombing mission in Germany and over Saint-Nazaire in France, right at the edge. That was a big Nazi sub-base. They got hit. And so he climbs out, but he never kept his parachute. He couldn't fit in there with him. So he climbed out to go get his parachute. They get hit again. And he gets knocked out of the plane at 22,000 feet with no parachute. He landed on a railroad station in Saint-Nazaire, which had a glass roof, and he survived. And the Nazis thought it must be a message from somebody upstairs at this guy. So they took care of him. They repaired him, put him back together. Of course, they then sent him to prison camp for 2.5 years, but he survived and lived to the age of 86. Another B-17 situation that I think is pretty interesting. There's Saint-Nazaire, and that's the railroad station he landed on. Okay. Another B-17 that's kind of interesting is Charlie Brown, who was flying one, and he'd gone over Bremen and dropped his bombs and was coming back across. He's flying, and he's been hit, and it's hard to keep the plane up. And from the ground, a German ace named Franz Stigler sees this limping plane, and he's one kill away from being the ace. And so he hops in his plane. He's going to go up and get him. He flies up behind him and sees that the ball turret gunner is already dead. And all of a sudden he has this change of heart. He said, I can't, this is like shooting someone who's sick. And so he pulls up next to the guy and starts waving to Charlie Brown. And Charlie, what's this? And so Charlie Brown flies home, and Franz Stigler follows him in his plane so they won't shoot any anti-aircraft fire up at him until he got to the shore, and he went back to England. In the 80s, Charlie Brown was talking to a bunch of other veterans. They said, well, did you ever want to find out who that guy was? So he started to research who the guy was. And he finds out it's Franz Stigler, and he locates him in Vancouver, British Columbia, where he has moved after the war. Okay, they get together and go on vacation and become buddies for the next 15 years of their life. And Franz Stigler said he was closer than any brother I ever had. The next B-17 story is Glenn Rojan. And he was returning from a bombing run over Hamburg in Germany. And he was flying in formation, and the plane in front of him got shot down, and so his instructions were to go fill that spot. Well, the guy below him thought the same thing, and they stuck. So now they're stuck together and they can't get apart. So all the guys in the bottom plane bailed out. He ordered all of his crew to bail out, but his co-pilot refused the order. His co-pilot's name was Leak, and he refused the order. And they went and they landed, and when they landed, the bottom plane hit and came off, and they slid off and came to a safe landing. They got captured. The Germans wanted to know what this new secret weapon was that they had. He, you know, after they were POWs, got separated. He didn't see Leak again until 1987, and he bumped into him in the States, and they got to share some time together. Glenn Rojan lived near Erie, Pennsylvania, and he was good friends of the person of my last story, and that's the American St. Nicholas of Wiltz. This is Dick Brookins, who lives in Pittsburgh, and he was just a corporal in the 28th Division, and they decided, because the local kids had not had a St. Nicholas Day, which is 5th of December, in all the years that the Nazis had run their town, the Nazis made the kids take German names. They renamed all the streets. They took all of the men and sent them either into the German army or made them go into slave labor work. And so they said it would be great if we could have a holiday for the kids. They haven't had it in 5 years. So he and his buddies got all of their candy and cookies from home and wrapped them up. He got the local bishop's outfit and a mitre, which was about 2 sizes too small for his head, gave him a headache. Anyway, he pretended to be St. Nicholas and passed out candy to these kids. And then for 30 years, he went home, started to work for Rochester Telephone, life went on, and 30 years later, they finally get a hold of him, they located him. And they said, look, it's a national holiday. We celebrate it every year. And they want him to come back. Well, he's been back 5 times. Next year will be the 70th anniversary, and if he's well enough, he might make the trip again. My wife and I and my grandchildren got to go there this summer and did a tour around Wiltz. And you see in the middle of that picture is the monument they've made. It's his name. They've written about him. He's a national hero there. They collect, they do it every year. Last year, they had over 10,000 bags of candy they gave out. It is a national holiday, all from one guy who just wanted to do something nice for a bunch of kids, well, a bunch of guys. He is the only guy from his outfit who's still alive. And he thinks it's his purpose to tell this story and tell about what a great job these guys did, always taking care of kids. There is the updated monument. That's the town of Wiltz. This is where he handed out the candy to those kids. That's on our visit this summer. Okay. Each and every veteran is a precious piece of American history. And that's why I do it. And I want to thank you veterans for your service. If you'd like it, I found the words to taps. And I think the words are beautiful, the original words. If you want a copy of it, we can pass them around. And with that, I'd like to end the presentation.